Some anime have gorgeous animation, compelling characters, touching stories, funny jokes, or all of the above. You have heard of Demon Slayer, and as of writing this, July in 2024, the most popular Demon Slayer review on YouTube is Captain Mac's Demon Slayer is extraordinarily incompetent. And by following the recommended videos on it, there seems to be a trend of people bashing Demon Slayer, and calling it not only overrated, but going out of their way to say the series is worthless, which got stronger as even people who used to like the show began to criticize it during the Swordsmith Village arc. So following the recent hype of Infinity Castle, I'd like to look at the series as a casual Demon Slayer fan who has only watched up until the episode Nezuko conquered the sun. Before we discuss Demon Slayer being overrated or overhated, we should define what these terms mean. Overrated is the most widely and correctly used term, just meaning something is seen as better than it is. I think it's worth stressing that something being overrated does not mean it's bad. If someone said New Vegas has no flaws, they would be overrating it, because it isn't a perfect video game. But that does not make New Vegas bad. It would only be overrated. In the same vein, I think overhated would refer to something being seen as bad or worse, when it is simply better than the perceived quality. But I don't think that saying something is overhated suddenly makes it good or amazing, only better than whatever bad level we're talking about. If that makes sense, we just need to briefly go over most of Demon Slayer's aspects to see whether or not it is rightly or wrongly hated. No one needs me to tell them that the animation Demon Slayer, produced by Ufotable, is some of the most striking and beautiful animation to be released in the past decade. It seamlessly adapts good or even great manga panels into smooth, flowing scenes that maintain the original impact of the manga with all the benefits of motion. Combined with good voice acting in both the sub or dub, a stunning soundtrack and satisfying sound design, a moment like Set Your Heart Ablaze, which is a very impressive and cool panel in the manga, becomes an emotional, moving scene that changes the experience from seeing Rengoku's passion to feeling it for yourself. Compared to something like My Hero Academia, which after season 3 just seems to do worse versions of the manga panels with weak in-betweens, at least when Sakuga isn't used, Demon Slayer fills in the in-betweens of panels in ways that make logical sense and feel good to watch. While this will sound like an insult to Gotoge's art, a good number of the drawings and illustrations in their work do leave a little something to be desired. Unlike series like Berserk or One Piece, where the page-to-page experience is something the anime adaptations of those series have struggled to capture, Demon Slayer actually finds the stills in its anime improving on the artwork of the manga, which I mean less as an insult to the mangaka and a compliment to Ufotable. The presentation of Demon Slayer is unquestionably staggering. While animation is unanimously agreed on, everything else is shaky. The most vocal complaint people who like and hate the show have with it is the power scaling, which I need to distinguish from the act of making versus battles here, because of my channel's videos. When I make a video like, could Denji be a hero, I'm comparing the fights he had to see if he's strong or fast enough to survive against villains like Stain or Muscular. I'm playing with action figures in a way I enjoy very much. What I mean here when I say the power scale of Demon Slayer is the aspect of writing that is the battle system and the weight characters have in it. Just like in a show like Breaking Bad, where Walter needs to use his intelligence, physical strength, willpower, and resources to overcome obstacles in his life, shonen battle characters leverage all the aspects of their character and power system to win battles. To reference a series I've already covered, think Jujutsu Kaisen. A character like Takuba's power relies on his perception of finding himself funny, meaning the best way to overcome the power isn't to ignore the humor or fight it head on, but to embrace it and satisfy Takuba's need to find approval. On the other hand, Yuji has almost no powers or abilities until Shinjuku. But despite this, he does fight head on because the best strengths Yuji has aren't his combat abilities, but his compassion and willpower. Then you have characters like Gojo, who finds himself isolated due to his strength, a strength that literally keeps people away. The power scale and the way it ties into a character isn't simply a power system in the versus battle sense, it's a measure of the show's character writing and story pacing. If a character gets too strong too fast, it's not power scaling's fault, it's pacing. If a power-up feels unearned, it's writing. From there are a few major power scaling moments people take issue with. Tanjiro learning the Hinokami Kagura against the lower moon, awakening the Demon Slayer mark against the upper moon, and using a Hashira level Nichiren sword during Swordsmith Village. The first place to start would actually be final selection, as we see Tanjiro was able to defeat the demon that had been killing Urikadaki's children. Despite eating dozens of them, which directly makes demons stronger, Tanjiro alone defeats it, demonstrating an innate talent. Whether it's fair or not, in the real world, two people can perform the same task over and over for years and grow at different rates. While I do personally like untalented characters, since talent is something everyone in the real world can't relate to, most people don't actually have an issue with Tanjiro doing this, since it shows who Tanjiro is. Despite being someone intelligent enough he could recognize his superiority to the other students, he spends the final moments with the demon trying to sympathize and help him pass on, rather than brag. This already means Tanjiro is not normal, so the rate he grows and abilities he can unlock are now freer from expectation than, for example, a character like Naruto, who was repeatedly insulted and reminded of his middling performance in the academy. To defend the Hinokami Kagura, we know sun breathing was passed down and turned into various breathing styles, since no one else could effectively utilize it. The act of breathing is somewhat an allegory of self-expression, that while something like medical science might be the strongest way to save a life, things like practicing defense attorney or creating art can also save people. In that way, water breathing was never Tanjiro's true calling, but it was the one he had learned to compensate for the extreme difficulty his true style causes him. And fully embracing that is something he did out of sheer willpower to save his sister, which is the thematic emphasis of the fight. He used the respect he had for his father as an example to find the strength to protect his sister. There are certainly issues, like the fact that his relationship with his father hadn't been emphasized before now, but you can also argue the immediate revelation makes the first viewing of the scene way more impactful. Either way, this isn't bad writing, just writing that isn't perfect. Awakening the Demon Slayer mark and Nichiren sword are far less easy to defend, since they aren't explicitly explained very well in lore or the direct story. One roundabout method to say that Tanjiro's mark is fine would be to compare Tanjiro's talent to Rengoku, a Hashira who never awakened a mark. We know Rengoku's father considered him talentless, and that Rengoku's personal story emphasizes the drive and passion to overcome the limitations placed upon him. That he proves his father wrong is an emotional scene because of his lack of comparative potential. Tanjiro, by possessing the mark, has categorically higher talent than Rengoku, which is consistent considering Tanjiro trained under a Hashira and demonstrated 1 in a dozen innate potential, compared to Rengoku being the son of a Hashira and training under him since childhood, to still be considered a failure in terms of potential. In that way, it is consistent for Tanjiro to awaken a mark, but I wouldn't blame you for saying it's poorly explained. Lastly is the Swordsmith Village arc, in which Mitsuri tells Tanjiro that fighting and surviving against an upper moon is the same as training for decades. This is really just a case of anime logic, it's take it or leave it. Zenkai boosts, quirk awakenings, Black Flash, whether you accept it is up to you, but acting like this is an exception amongst shonen is disingenuous, and there's already evidence Tanjiro has been doing this. After losing to the lowest moon, he recovers and trains and is able to fight with and help defeat an amped lower moon. Then, after recovering from his near-death injuries in that fight, recovers, does light training, and is able to hold his own against the lowest upper moon Daki. After that fight, he can decapitate the upper 4 with help from the Hashira who had awakened her mark, as well as Nezuko and Gaia. Again, this is more of an issue with the writing not conveying this in a satisfactory manner. As if Shinobu had explained this during rehabilitation training, it wouldn't feel nearly as bad here. So again, not perfect, but not trash or painful either. All this discussion on power scaling has repeatedly called into question the 2 aspects of Demon Slayer that seem to be generally disliked by the wider community, that being world building and character writing. The lack of information on Demon Slayer marks and Nichiren swords is flatly unimpressive, as these elements contribute significantly to represent character growth and power. Combined with breathing being an extraordinarily underdeveloped power system, and it's easy to see that while the power scale of Demon Slayer is more or less simple and fine, the writing elements backing it up give it almost no spine. A power system being simple and having little to no lore is fine, as something like Ki in Dragon Ball or Chakra in Naruto before Shippuden worked just fine, as those shows rely on the character work to sell those power systems. However, whether Demon Slayer has good or bad characters might be more questionable. While I certainly like them and the show sold me on them, I'm not very difficult to please. Someone like Rengoku is inserted into the story to be likable, given a somewhat tragic or sympathetic backstory in the middle of their life or death battle, then killed in a dramatic way to motivate or stump the characters around them. Considering Rengoku's limited presence before Mugen Train and death in it, this is certainly not up for debate. But what I think is up for debate is whether or not that method of storytelling is compelling or boring. While I think this is certainly weaker than the death of a character who has been properly introduced, builds a relationship with other characters, then grows or regresses such that we feel for them either way, and then is killed to show the tragedy or failure of that character, that does not mean a one-off character is inherently bad. For me, Rengoku's two appearances contrast one another, as he initially wanted to murder Nezuko and Tanjiro flatly, which I actually like, as it lines up with his straightforward and unwavering conviction to slay demons. However, this is superseded by the respect he has for the Master, as the Master ordered Nezuko's pardon. This tells us above protecting others, he respects those who do more, and upon defending Tanjiro's strength in his conversation with Akaza, acknowledges Tanjiro's passion as a demon slayer. Rengoku didn't change in between these instances, his perspective did, as Tanjiro protected the train's passengers. As I mentioned in the power scaling part, Rengoku doesn't have that much raw talent, and worked from a young age to be where he is. Even as strong as he had become, he acknowledges that if you are disheartened, if you feel you aren't enough, to set your heart ablaze. That resonates incredibly hard with me, and not just because of my own struggles, but because of how the story conveyed Rengoku's strength as a human through his passion, despite his lack of power. Even if some characters are lacking, when it needs to be, I think the character writing in the show is at least good. Sometimes great like Rengoku. As of Swordsmith Village, there have been some good characters like Mitsuri and Inosuke, but there has been one that is very noticeably disappointing. Nezuko. While this is something people don't like to talk about, shonen manga tend to be at least accidentally or slightly misogynistic. In Demon Slayer, there are three main areas to be concerned with: Zenitsu, Nezuko, and the Hashira. The Hashira are 50-50, as the two girl Hashira use a flimsy bendy pink sword and has her chest exposed the entire time. Being the love Hashira, she finds something she can love in most people. The other Hashira being Shinobu, who's too weak to decapitate demons, and has to use her butterfly breathing and poisons to compensate. While this does look pretty iffy, I will say I do sort of click with Mitsuri, as her backstory and explanation of being someone who's judged for her natural looks is something I can understand. Shinobu is harder to defend, but I do think her ability to make poisons is something very cool, if let down by the writing. I think it would be easier to see this as her strength instead of as her weakness if her breathing style made it so she was the only person capable to use the poisons. But as it is, she's certainly not a good look for this argument. Zenitsu is much more blatant, since everyone else in the story seems to look down on him for his behavior. Nezuko, however, is a pretty bad character. While the Hashira are important, it's somewhat understandable that the secondary group of main characters might have less women than men, but for the main four characters to consist of a male trio and a girl, you would expect that girl to have a character. Nezuko is a dog, by most means. She does what she's told, craves attention, protects her owner, wears a muzzle, and even obediently stays in her cage when she needs to. This would be one thing all on its own, but the story goes out of its way to make this worse. She de-ages after being infected by Muzan's blood, and when she uses her demon powers, re-ages physically, while becoming more feral and less human-like. This is almost literal infantilization. With her moments of re-aging sexualized, it just leads to the idea of Nezuko being more of an object than an actual person. As hard as I've tried to defend Demon Slayer, Nezuko's writing is really fucking weird, and honestly deserves more criticism than it currently gets. The last thing I couldn't figure out how to organically talk about is themes, and for the most part, the only consistent themes I can see are those of self-determination and redemption. Rengoku, Mitsuri, Tenzen, Muichiro, Tomioka, and Tanjiro all strongly choose for themselves what they think they should do with their own lives, even if it ends up being to protect others. For all of them, the reasons they choose to do so are their own. As someone who can only see the point in living and doing what you can with your life to your own ends, selfishly and selflessly, this resonates incredibly strongly with me, and I would assume if you're a sentient human being, it would with you too. The more questionable theme is redemption, as Demon Slayer makes a point that anyone can be redeemed, whether that means those who alienated their families or serial killers that will surely burn in hell. All people are worthy of being viewed as people, no matter what actions they commit. I personally do think this is a case where the writing doesn't capture me, but the presentation actually sways the impact of the theme, with a beautiful score and good voice acting. In the Lower Moon's death, we see Tanjiro defend his corpse from being defiled by Tomioka, and says you won't ever hesitate to kill a demon, but that even as a demon they were once people, the same as him. The Lower Moon then reminisces on his time with his family, and about how Tanjiro reminded him of who he was. His parents confront him saying they will stay together in hell. Clearly, he isn't forgiven for what he did, but he is still a person, and Tanjiro respected that. From Ryu, Kyogai, and even Daki and Gyutaro, they are killed, but Tanjiro makes his best efforts to respect that they are people and to allow them to find redemption, making their way to hell as people instead of monsters. I do think his view should be questioned more than it is, and in an ideal world his view would be challenged by non-demons that are just as evil. But on its own, the theme isn't that bad or harmful, mostly kind of mediocre or good at times. So, is Demon Slayer overhated? I would say yes. Is Demon Slayer peak? Hell no. The bland power system relies on animation, and the emotional moments rely on soundtrack and voice acting. And besides that are only pockets into a genuinely great story and characters like Rengoku. But does all art have to be amazing, peak, absolutely goated? I was recently talking to a friend about whether or not stories that rely on surprising plot twists are good or bad, and she mentioned that calling something mediocre because of certain qualities is shitty to do. But I don't think something has to be measurably good to be enjoyed. Demon Slayer, if you want a number, is a 5 or 6 out of 10 for me. But I like it. Even if the show struggles in certain elements, I was personally touched by it, and the show having a shallow power system, bad world building, or rushed pacing won't change that. I enjoyed it, and I found value in the show for myself, even if it's not the best piece of art on the planet.